In the summer of 1943, as the dust of North Africa still clung to the boots of retreating Axis soldiers, a strange silence settled over Italian camps. Men who had marched under the banner of the Duce for years suddenly sensed something shifting, something breaking. Mussolini had fallen. The Allies were landing on Italian beaches, and in the shadows of their former ally Germany was preparing its answer. Italian soldiers, exhausted from years of disastrous campaigns in Greece, Russia, and Africa, stood on a fault line of history. Their commanders whispered questions no one dared say aloud. What happens when yesterday's ally becomes tomorrow's occupier? What orders do you follow when your government switches sides overnight? And what will these men say when the command finally arrives? Fight the Germans. This is the hidden story of the Italian army after the armistice of September 1943, of confusion, defiance, betrayal, and the extraordinary words spoken by soldiers who suddenly had to choose between surrender, obedience, or resistance against one of the most powerful armies on earth. July 25, 1943, Rome. By nightfall, the news had already swept through barracks, trench lines, and coastal batteries. Benito Mussolini had fallen. The Grand Council had voted, the king had acted, and suddenly the man who had led Italy into war was gone. For many Italian officers, the announcement felt less like a political shift and more like the ground opening beneath their feet. Across the peninsula, commanders stared at their dispatches in disbelief. The chain of command, already strained by years of defeats in North Africa, Sicily, and the Eastern Front, began to fracture. Messages came riddled with contradiction. Some units were told to continue fighting the Allied advance in Sicily. Others received quiet hints from Rome: hold your positions but avoid unnecessary engagement. And between those lines, an unspoken truth lingered. Italy no longer knew which war it was fighting, or for whom. The confusion spread far beyond Italy's borders. Italian divisions stationed in southern France, the Balkans, and the Aegean watched German troop convoys rolling south, officially to reinforce Axis defenses. But officers who had served alongside German formations for years recognized the shift immediately. These weren't reinforcements. They were contingencies, precise, calculated, prepared. In the days that followed, the strangeness deepened. German officers arrived at Italian command posts with smiles and cordial handshakes, insisting cooperation was more important than ever. Yet behind those gestures, their forces quietly seized rail networks, ports, bridges, and ammunition depots, always for security reasons. Italian patrols reported German armored columns positioning themselves near key HQs, gun emplacements, and supply hubs. No one issued an alarm. No one dared. By early September, tension lay over every regiment like a storm cloud. The Allies were advancing up the peninsula. Rome was negotiating secretly with the British and Americans, and Italy's own soldiers were left listening to rumors swirl through canteens, barracks, and dugouts. An armistice is coming. No, it's a German trap. The government has already fled. Then, on the evening of 8 September 1943, clarity arrived in the most chaotic way possible. Broken radio transmissions, officers shouting half-confirmed reports, troops gathering around makeshift loudspeakers as Marshal Pietro Badoglio's voice crackled through with the words that ended 3 years of alliance with Berlin. The armistice with the Allied forces has been signed. The reaction was shock, relief, and dread. Because the soldiers knew one thing instantly: German forces already inside Italy wouldn't simply stand down. Within hours, across France, the Balkans, and the Italian homeland, German units opened sealed orders. Operation Achse had begun. And for the first time since 1940, Italian soldiers were about to hear orders no one imagined possible. Night fell unevenly across Italy, the Balkans, and southern France on 8 September 1943. But everywhere the same strange ripple swept through Italian outposts, a tremor of news carried by fractured signals, stunned officers and soldiers gathering around radios that barely held their frequency. The armistice had been announced, but no one yet understood what it meant. Then the second message arrived. Short, unthinkable. Transmitted to commands from the Comando Supremo in Rome. Le forze tedesche devono essere considerate ostili. German forces are to be treated as hostile. For 3 years, Italians had fought side by side with them. Italian infantry had advanced under German air cover in Greece. Their armored units had been rebuilt with German tanks after North Africa. Their officers had eaten at the same tables, planned in the same rooms, fought in the same trenches. Now they were being told, prepare to resist them. Across the peninsula and occupied territories, the reaction was immediate, but far from uniform. In the 33rd Infantry Division Acqui on Cephalonia, officers remembered the room falling silent. The order read twice because no one believed they'd heard it correctly. On Corsica, veterans of the 80th Infantry Regiment whispered in disbelief. Fight the Germans, after all this time. Along the Dalmatian coast, artillerymen wrote in their diaries of the moment the realization struck. We were betrayed twice, first by Mussolini, now by Berlin. Others tried to cling to resolve. Better die standing than kneel again. But unity was impossible. Rome's instructions were vague, contradictory, and often delivered hours late. Some commanders, like General Antonio Gandin in Cephalonia, hesitated, torn between loyalty to former comrades-in-arms and duty to the Italian crown. Others ordered immediate resistance, raising barricades in port towns and positioning machine gun nests along mountain passes. A few quietly negotiated local surrenders, hoping to avoid bloodshed. Others simply walked away, abandoning posts that suddenly seemed impossible to defend. The truth was brutally simple. Italy was not ready for this fight. Most divisions were exhausted, under-equipped, and scattered. Ammunition stocks were thin after years of continuous retreats. Armored units had almost no fuel. Supply depots were already in German hands, and German formations from the 1st Parachute Division, the 16th Panzergrenadiers, and elements of Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, were fully mobilized. They had been preparing for this moment since July. By midnight, the consequences became visible. In northern Tuscany, German half-tracks rolled past Italian police stations with deliberate slowness. In the Balkans, columns of Wehrmacht infantry marched toward Italian barracks, smiling politely as if nothing had changed. In Naples, tank engines rumbled through the darkness, encircling coastal artillery positions before their crews even understood what was happening. Within hours of the armistice, the trap had begun to close. German armored units moved with clinical precision, forming rings around airfields, naval bases, and barracks, tightening minute by minute. Italia's soldiers had received the order no one expected. And now, surrounded on every front, they were about to face the consequences. The first shots came before dawn. In Rome, Florence, Ljubljana, on the islands of the Dodecanese and the cliffs of Corsica, German paratroopers and panzer grenadiers moved with a precision the Italians had never seen directed at them before. They struck command posts, ammunition depots, radio stations, all locations they had quietly mapped weeks earlier. What began as polite cooperation turned, in a matter of minutes, into open assault. On the outskirts of Rome, elements of the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division swept toward key intersections and government buildings. The Italian Granatieri di Sardegna, one of the oldest and most prestigious regiments in the Royal Army, scrambled to form defensive lines. Many had only a few dozen rounds each. Their anti-tank guns were relics, 47 pieces nearly useless against German armored cars. Yet they held. For hours, they traded fire in the streets around Porta San Paolo and Villa Ascians. Civilians watched from shuttered windows as former allies exchanged bursts of machine gun fire across tram lines and shattered cobblestones. One grenadier wrote later, "They wore the same uniforms as our comrades from Africa and Russia. Now they gave us an ultimatum at gunpoint." Across Italy, similar scenes unfolded, but the shock was even sharper in the occupied territories. In Slovenia, at Ljubljana, German troops moved to disarm the local Italian garrison. When officers resisted, firefights erupted through the streets. In the Aegean, the Dodecanese Islands became battlegrounds as German airborne units clashed with stunned Italian defenders. And then came Cephalonia, the most tragic and violent confrontation of them all. The 33rd Infantry Division, Acqui, nearly 12,000 strong, rejected German demands for unconditional surrender. For days, they fought a brutal series of engagements against Gebirgsjäger and supporting artillery. Italian batteries answered shell for shell. Infantry companies counterattacked hills they had climbed alongside the Germans only months earlier. But the outcome was inevitable. When their lines collapsed and ammunition ran out, thousands of Acqui soldiers were captured. What happened next remains one of the darkest episodes of the Italian campaign. More than 5,000 Italian prisoners were executed between 21 and 24 September 1943, one of the largest mass killings of surrendered troops in World War II. At sea, the Italian Navy wrestled with the same impossible choices. Some crews steamed toward Allied ports under the armistice orders. Others, unwilling to hand their ships over to Germany, scuttled them in harbors from La Spezia to the Aegean. In Sardinia and Corsica, naval infantry fought running battles along the coasts, supporting army units trying to withdraw south. Everywhere, the same chaos played out in miniature. One order from Rome instructing units not to provoke the Germans. Another, minutes later, commanding them to resist. Armies need clarity. Instead, the Regio Esercito received confusion and paid for it in blood. Between 8 and 20 September, the numbers tell the scale of the catastrophe. Over 600,000 Italian soldiers were disarmed and taken prisoner by German forces. More than 15,000 were killed resisting disarmament in Italy, Greece, France, and the Balkans. Those who fought did so without air support, without logistics, and often without their commanders. Those who surrendered faced captivity in harsh conditions, many deported to labor camps in Germany and Poland. By the third week of September, the soldiers who remained in the field confronted a question no army wants to ask. If Rome had fallen, if the Germans controlled the roads, the ports, the fuel, the headquarters, what were they even fighting for now? In the days after the armistice, Italy's front lines dissolved into something far more personal, a battlefield not of armies, but of conscience. The collapse of the chain of command left every soldier facing the same unforgiving decision. Which Italy would he serve now? There were no clear orders, no unified leadership, only rumors, fear, and the thunder of German columns advancing through the very barracks where Italians had once trained beside them. And in that chaos, three paths emerged, each carrying its own cost. The first was to remain with Germany under the newly formed Italian Social Republic, the Repubblica Social Italiana, the RSI. Mussolini, rescued by German special forces at Gran Sasso on 12 September 1943, had been installed as the head of this puppet state. Units like the XAMAS, the Black Brigades, and elements of the former Italian army reformed under German command. For some soldiers, this choice came from loyalty to fascism. For others, it was simple, brutal logic. Joining the RSI meant survival. It meant food, pay, and protection from German reprisals. Yet many who took that path left behind bitter testimonies. One officer later wrote, I fought beside them in Africa, and now they marched us to trains like prisoners. Because the second path was surrender, and its true nature became clear almost immediately. German forces did not treat them as prisoners of war. Hitler classified them instead as Italian military internees, stripping them of every protection guaranteed by the Geneva Convention. Over 600,000 Italian troops were deported to labor camps in Germany, Poland, and the occupied territories. Many were sent to factories, mines, or construction projects, often in deadly conditions. Thousands never returned. A soldier captured in the Balkans described the moment bluntly. We laid down our rifles expecting captivity. What came was slavery. The third path emerged in forests, mountains, and rubble-strewn cities, joining the partisans. These were soldiers who refused to fight for Mussolini, refused to bow to Germany, and refused to accept deportation. They fled into the Apennines, the Alps, and the countryside around Turin, Milan, and Bologna. Others joined Allied units in the south, forming the Italian co-belligerent army, fighting under British and American command. But this choice, too, tore families apart. Brothers split by politics, fathers choosing surrender so their sons could escape, veterans who couldn't bring themselves to fire on former comrades, standing beside men who had lost everything to German occupation. Across the peninsula, German commanders carried out their duties with stark efficiency. Yet there were moments, rare but real, where humanity slipped through. A lieutenant in Tuscany, overwhelmed by what he was ordered to do, quietly warned an Italian captain to flee before the arrest squads arrived. Near Trento, a German sergeant told his Italian counterpart, "Go, I didn't see you." But such gestures could not alter the storm. Italy had changed sides. The government in Rome marched with the Allies. The RSI marched with Berlin. And hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers stood between them, forced to choose not just a uniform, but a future. The Kingdom of Italy had made its decision. But the Italian soldier still had to decide, alone, which Italy he would fight for. In the months and years that followed, long after Italy's front lines had shifted north, and the gunfire around Cassino and the Gothic line had faded, the men who lived through the armistice wrote words that captured the heartbreak and the clarity of those days. From prison barracks in Germany, scribbled on scraps of Red Cross paper, one soldier wrote, "History will judge us not for our victories, but for the moment we said enough." Another, hiding in the Apennines with a partisan brigade, confessed in a tattered notebook, "We fought for Italy for the first time only after the armistice." These voices reveal what the battle lines of 1943 truly created, not just a military collapse, but a moment in which the Italian soldier confronted the meaning of loyalty, identity, and nationhood. From the ashes of shattered divisions, new formations emerged. Former infantrymen, artillerymen, Alpine troops, and carabinieri slipped into valleys and forests, forming the Brigate Garibaldi, the Giustizia e Libertà units, and countless local partisan groups. Their sabotage missions, intelligence gathering, and mountain warfare became essential to the Allied advance in 1944 and 1945. Allied commanders later acknowledged that partisan operations tied down dozens of German battalions, disrupted supply lines, and opened corridors for the liberation of central and northern Italy. But the struggle was never simple. Italy entered a civil war within a world war, Italian partisans and co-belligerent troops against German forces and Italian units loyal to the RSI. Villages became fault lines. Families divided themselves along ideology, survival, or the scars left by the occupation. Historians now view the armistice not as a clean break, and not merely as surrender, but as the crucible in which the identity of the modern Italian soldier, and in many ways the Italian nation, was forged. It was a moment that forced millions to decide who they were when the old order cracked apart. The legacy is written in three stark images. The vast, silent columns of 600,000 deported soldiers carried away to Germany for slave labor. The last stands at Rome, Cephalonia, and the ports where sailors scuttled their ships rather than surrender them. And the mountain fighters who kept the flame of resistance alive through two bitter winters. In their words preserved in archives, diaries, and fading letters, the truth remains. We fought because, for once, we could choose our enemy. In a war defined by empires and vast mechanized armies, the Italian soldier's greatest battlefield became the one inside himself, the fight to decide who he truly was when the world he knew collapsed overnight.